Hello and welcome to another lecture on the topic of eco-modernism. In this presentation I'll be looking at the question of whether technology and nature should be considered enemies and whether natural is always good. It's a question at the core of the topic of eco-modernism, which is a philosophy that fundamentally believes that technology is our best tool to combat climate change and all the other environmental disasters that we see around us. And I accept that's a fairly bizarre claim, because in most cases it's actually technology that got us into this mess in the first place. But does that mean that technology does not deserve a starring role in our fight back against global warming? After all, when we discovered metalworking as a species, we discovered a new way to make deadlier weapons, but we also simultaneously discovered a way to protect ourselves from those weapons using armour. Might this be the same? Have our technological advances given us both the means to destroy our fragile ecosystem and also the mechanism to cleanse it? And what about this claim that the only way to fight the destruction of our environment is to shrink back from modernity and retreat to a simpler time when we were at harmony with nature? Is the only way to restore balance to revert back to a time when we were just much less significant? Or could we create a new balance aligned with the flourishing of all 8 billion of us on this planet Earth? While we're at it, what's behind the claim that natural is always best? It's true that some artificial things are bad, such as plastics polluting the ocean and heavy metals poisoning our rivers. But does that mean that natural is always good? Is natural the virtuous term it appears to be? All these questions, and many more, will be answered in this presentation. So let's get started. Technology has brought us from the state of nature to the present day. It has led us from a life of almost perpetual suffering, with diseases and warfare ravaging our lives, where most children died before they could even walk, and nobody survived long enough to die of old age, to a place where, at least in the developed world, we enjoy an almost unimaginable level of luxury. Think about it for a while. Which would you rather be? A homeless person living a life of misery on the streets in a modern society, or that same person living like an average human being might have done 10,000 years ago, at the same geographical location but without any human technology? I don't just mean no cars, telephones or microwave ovens, but I mean no synthetic fabrics to make clothes, no substantial kind of shelter except for twigs and leaves and mud huts, no pure water, no farming, no delicious calorie-dense modern fruit, grain and vegetables. If the crops failed or a plague arrived in town, no amount of friendly passers-by could help you. What's more, you were surrounded by neighbouring tribes with a desire to kill and eat you, and an environment full of dangerous carnivorous animals. It's a strange thing to say, and this doesn't in any way take away from the vast levels of human suffering that definitely exist in our modern society, but at least in the developed world, almost everyone today is better off than almost everyone was 100 years ago. In fact, here's another good game to play. Let's imagine you can choose to live like any famous person from history. What is the furthest back in time you would choose to go? It's tempting to pick a wealthy king or queen from the Tudor times with vast palaces and castles and armies of servants to do your every whim, and more power than nearly any other human being on earth. Who wouldn't want to be a Henry VIII or Elizabeth I? Or maybe Louis XIV of France? Maybe you would go back to Roman times and be a Julius Caesar or a Cleopatra. Is that not a life of absolute luxury? Well, in case that argument persuades you, let me mention 3 things that I suspect you would rather not do without for any money. The first is anaesthesia. If you've ever had any teeth removed, then imagine what that would be like when you're awake to feel every agonising moment. What about having limbs removed while awake? And remember, from that list I gave you earlier, Louis XIV died of gangrene after all. If you've ever had any surgery, then imagine that being done without modern standards of cleanliness and without any kind of anaesthesia to take away the pain. And the second thing to bear in mind is a modern understanding of pathology, including antibiotics and simple cleanliness. Just think back over history to the countless billions of human beings who died, often at a very young age, to the ravages of diseases which are nowadays almost unheard of. Again, imagine that surgery with the very real risk that the surgeon's blade, while slicing into you, is also transmitting microscopic bacteria into your flesh which will kill you slowly over the course of a few weeks or months. And finally, what about having clean drinking water in your home? Not water full of parasites and pathogens that you have to drag up from a well half an hour's walk away, or some murky pond water full of decomposing weeds, but clean water that you can get right in your warm home, totally pure, filtered, safe to drink without any risk of dysentery, cholera or typhoid, just by turning a tap. You know I could go on. I could talk about the bubonic plague and smallpox, and the times when a third of the population of Europe died within the space of a few years to one simple disease. Between 1347 and 1351, more people died of the Black Death than died in both great wars of the 20th century combined, times 2. It took a century and a half for the world's population to recover to its previous level. Smallpox killed roughly 5 million people per year at its height, including, just for the record, 6 monarchs, one of whom was Louis XIV's great-grandson Louis XV. Another was Queen Mary II of England. We eradicated it entirely in the 20th century using technology. So let's forget about medical advances for now and just ask you a simple question. If you could go back in time and live just 50 years ago, would you? Really? Actually, when people talk about going back to nature or retreating from modernity, what I think they mostly mean is retreating from the bad aspects of modernity, from the work stress, from the concrete jungles that are our modern cities. They want to explore the great outdoors, enjoy time in woodlands and parklands. Of course, I love all that stuff. We want to preserve it as much as possible. But what people don't tend to mean is wandering around half naked in the cold and rain of midwinter, foraging for roots to keep yourself from starving to death, trying to sleep shivering in the mud with an agonising toothache and hobbling on a leg injury that will gradually kill you from gangrene and sepsis. That's what nature is really like. So let's put to one side the possibility of throwing away all our modern technology. For everything we've discovered, there's been a degree of positive and negative, but the overall effect is extremely positive. After all, every technology since pointed rocks has been used for both improving our lives and also for worsening them. Flint was used to make knives to carve meat for cooking, but it was also used to make weapons to smash people over the head with. But the march of technology has definitely brought us to a better place than we were in before. Well, most of us. Besides all of these arguments, there is literally no way the world is going backwards and throwing away technology we've already discovered. You can't forget things that people find valuable. And you can't tell starving children in sub-Saharan Africa that they can't have modern farming technologies to produce their food because we in the Western world have spent the last century destroying the environment, so now they don't get a chance to feed themselves. The most important aspect of modern environmentalism ought to be, like the famous affirmation from Alcoholics Anonymous, to identify the things we can change and the things we can't change, and to work on changing those things we can change and accepting the reality of the rest. The more effort we waste attempting to change something that will never change, the less energy we have to work on actually solving the problems that we face by working in areas where our efforts might actually have an effect. As I said in the introductory presentation in this series, we need to align our beliefs and strategies with reality, or else we won't get where we need to go. For example, the world is eating more meat. Now, I personally chose to reduce my meat intake quite a lot, and I've cut out red meat. Many people in the Western world are doing the same. The number of vegans is increasing at an enormous rate. It quadrupled from 2014 to 2019, at least in Britain. But it's still barely over 1% of the UK population, and it's not going to keep quadrupling because, to most people in the world, the idea of switching to a vegan diet is worse than torture. The response to this claim is often the same, to state the fact that if everyone in the world moves to a Western-style diet, then diet-related emissions of greenhouse gases will increase by an enormous 135%. And that is horrific and scary, of course. And if all 8 billion of us became vegan, then the global diet-related emissions would drop 70%, which would be great. I would love to see us slashing our greenhouse gas emissions that way, but I won't. It's not going to happen. Zero chance. Heck, we can't even get people to stop smoking when it's literally killing them. So what chance do we have to encourage them to give up delicious meat if the bad effects happen years later to other people? So we need to stop imagining that denying human nature is a plausible solution to this global problem, and instead accept the reality that literally billions of people worldwide are desperately trying to obtain a Western-style diet and lifestyle, with all its meat and cheese and processed foods. And we need to work out how we can make it much less impactful to the environment for them to do so. We'll come to that in a later presentation when we look at agriculture and meat, but there are definitely ways to do that, at least to some extent. There are other trends we need to accept too. As the developing world modernises, which is a very good thing in general, then they also want to copy all the vices that we Westerners have acquired, which is a bad thing, at least for the environment. As we've already said, they'll want to buy more food, including much more meat, but also more textiles, more plastic. They will buy bigger cars and drive them more. They will use more power, much more power, and they will want bigger and bigger houses with air conditioning and heating and swimming pools and fridge freezers and giant flat screen TVs and all that stuff. All of this is going to happen. Again, even if by some miracle we could convince a significant proportion of people in the rich world to give up their beloved luxuries and go back to a simpler way of life with less environmental impact, then it would still be delusional to think that everyone in the poorer countries of the world would be happy to skip the period of consumption and gluttony that we rich nations have enjoyed for decades and skip straight to the austere minimalism necessary to rescue the environment from oblivion. No, we need to find a solution that doesn't require billions of people to reject the kind of luxuriously addictive lifestyle that we in the developed world seem almost pathologically unable to give up ourselves. So, what's the solution? Am I saying it's impossible to live in harmony with nature? That we're destined to destroy more and more of the environment until everyone is doomed? No, I'm not saying that at all. What I'm saying is that living in harmony with nature does not require us to give up everything we have. Living in harmony is about balance. The science of climate change has shown us that we need to emit much less CO2. In fact, we should emit no more CO2 than the environment can cope with. But as we know, that doesn't mean we can't generate power anymore. It just means that we can't continue to use the old methods of power generation that put CO2 into the atmosphere. Instead, we need to use our technology to work out new ways of generating power, like solar, wind and geothermal. We are currently deforesting our planet at an alarming rate, and we need to reverse that trend. But that doesn't mean we can't use wood as a natural material in our homes. It just means that we have to use sustainable forests and research techniques for making our trees grow as quickly as possible so that we can regenerate lost woodland and supply our hunger for timber without destroying fragile habitats and removing vital carbon sinks. We are overfishing the seas, but there are ways of making our fisheries much more efficient by reducing the enormous amounts of wastage that modern fishing creates, by investing in managed fish farms, and by only fishing for species which are highly abundant in areas where their numbers are not in danger. And we can discover all of that using technological methods to track and monitor levels of fisheries around the planet. Living in harmony does not mean we don't interact with nature. It doesn't even mean that we don't take from nature where it has plenty to give. It just means that we're careful to take only what nature can sustain and to help replenish it when required. For years you may have been told that the only way we can save our environment is by denying all the luxuries that make the modern world so desirable. And unsurprisingly, the general public hasn't really been much of a fan of that particular project. But let me give you an alternative vision of the future, one that the public could get behind, in fact one that they are already getting behind. Let's take one specific example, energy. Human civilization requires lots of energy, and the more advanced the civilization, the more energy it requires. We started in prehistoric times by building small fires, then larger fires, then kilns and giant fire pits. Then we started burning coal in furnaces. Then we built power stations belching millions of tons of carbon dioxide into the air. If you believe that more technology equals more power equals greater impact, then you would never guess the next stage of this story. I only have the figures for the UK at hand, but it's a similar story across the developed world. Although our technological growth has continued relentlessly, energy use per person in the UK reached its peak in the early to mid-70s. It stayed reasonably stable until around the year 2000 and has been dropping fairly rapidly since then, with current consumption roughly 20% lower than it was at the beginning of this century. And as for the CO2 emissions, well, you know that technology gave us nuclear power as zero carbon technology, and more recently the incredible growth of solar and wind power. According to the UK gas and electricity markets regulator Ofgem, renewables now power roughly a third of UK electricity generation, a figure that is growing significantly each year, and they generate zero carbon dioxide while doing so. In the last 30 years, coal consumption has fallen by a factor of 10. Technology got us into the mess we're in, but technology is already getting us out of it. And more importantly, technology is able to clean up our act while still continuing to produce the power required for a modern society. In fact, far from increasing our consumption, technology is now in a phase where it's able to reduce our footprint on the Earth. For example, look at the smartphone that you almost certainly possess. 3.5 billion people worldwide own one. That's nearly half of all humans on the planet. Of course, it took some of the Earth's resources to make that technological marvel, and it takes a small amount of energy to power it. But think about what it does. You have a high-definition camera, not just much better than the state-of-the-art cameras 20 years ago, but much smaller. And of course there's no film, no processing, no printing, just digital images which only take up electrons. And you also get a high-definition video camera thrown in for free, and an email application, a media player, a notepad, a torch, a GPS device, a heart rate monitor, a games console, an encyclopedia, and a television. Oh, and a telephone. Just look at the range of items that are packed into that tiny device of yours, and ask yourself what the material requirements for all of those would be if they had been produced separately with year 2000 technology. What would their energy requirement be? What about all the disposable batteries required, the plastic film canisters, the plastic game cartridges, and so on and so on? And thanks to technology, you get all of that in the palm of your hand for a minuscule fraction of the material cost. In its early phases, technology may well have consumed more and more power with each generation, but we're in a stage now where it's doing the reverse. It's giving us more and more for less and less impact on the environment. So, technology has switched from being the enemy of nature to being its potential saviour. Of course, it's not as clear as that. Our increasingly sophisticated smartphones, for example, are reducing our impact on the environment, but it's still not zero. Smartphone batteries contain a number of toxic metals which have to be mined out of the earth, including significant quantities of cobalt. Waste electrical equipment can be extremely difficult and hazardous to deal with, and often ends up polluting landfills. The increasing technology of manufacturing leads to lower prices, which encourage overconsumption and therefore contribute to increasing the level of waste our society generates. I never said technology was purely good, but it gives us the tools to do good if we choose to do so. We are in a mess, that's true and undeniable, and it's largely technological advances that got us here. Technology also directly enables a lot of the activities that we need to do to research and combat climate change. Satellites monitor the level of deforestation, weather patterns, and changes in land use. Researchers communicate online using email, mobile phones, and messaging systems, and share large volumes of data in real time through super-fast fibre optic broadband networks. Supercomputers crunch through the vast calculations required to build our climate models. Sophisticated monitoring techniques with GPS transmitters and robotic submarines allow us to monitor the health of our oceans and the creatures within them. And the internet allows us to get the news out quickly and effectively to more people than ever before, without having to fell a single tree to make paper for books and pamphlets. The one fact that we need to accept is that we have already emitted pretty much all the CO2 that we can afford to release, and even if we stop emitting all of it tomorrow, we are already at a stage where the Earth's temperature is going to increase by roughly 1.5 degrees Celsius over pre-industrial levels, and that's really catastrophic. In a later lecture, I'll look at ways in which technology might help us to remove that extra CO2 from the atmosphere and store it away out of harm's way. I'll look at ways in which technology is helping us to understand the complicated mechanisms in soil chemistry and ocean biology that allow natural processes to sequester carbon out of the atmosphere in vast amounts, if we act carefully in accordance with the findings of modern science. The future can be scary once you look at the task ahead of us, but it's also exciting that we are beginning to direct and focus the whole ingenuity of humankind on this most pressing of problems, and the speed of change is unprecedented in human history. In summary, the claim that technology and nature are in opposition is simply wrong. It may have had a great deal more truth to it historically, but in the modern world, technology provides us with the tools that we need to combat any environmental problem. That doesn't mean that it's entirely benign. After all, technologies can almost always be used for good or ill. The internet that is used to disseminate papers and research on climate change is also used to spread lies and misinformation. But technology does hold the keys to extract ourselves and our planet from this self-inflicted mess. What we need to do is to accept that we are in a mess and that technology got us here, but that we can't undo the damage we've done by just wishing away all our technological advancements. What we have to do is identify the best route to take us from where we are now to where we need to go. It's extremely tempting to look at the vision of a natural life and yearn for the simplicity and connectedness with nature that it embodies. I'm the same. I would love to live that natural life, but within the framework that a technologically advanced society provides. I grow a lot of my own fruit and vegetables, but I still rely on refrigerators and freezers to store them, a microwave oven to heat them, and supermarkets to provide the food that I'm unable to grow for myself. I love going for walks in forests, but when I twist my ankle on a tree branch, I'm glad to have anti-inflammatory painkillers in my first aid kit. And for those miserable, cold, rainy winter days when being outdoors is really the last thing you want to do, I'm glad to be warmly wrapped up inside with double glazing, thick, well-insulated walls, central heating and a flat-screen TV. We can have nature and technology. In fact, I would argue that we must. Thanks very much for listening. I hope you continue to listen and join me on this journey through the world of eco-modernism. Next time, we'll start to look at power generation with an episode all about renewable energy.